There is a bridge sitting over the Detroit River right now. Finished, tested, ready. Every cable is in place. Every lane is complete. Every toll system has been installed. Every inspection checkpoint is ready. And yet, not a single car is using it. Think about that. A modern international bridge connecting two of North America's most important economic regions. A bridge that took years to build. A bridge that cost more than $6 billion. And today, it remains closed. Not because engineers failed, not because construction crews fell behind, not because of a safety problem. The bridge is finished. The problem is politics. Normally, that would already be enough to make headlines. But then the story became even stranger. Because this wasn't a shared project. It wasn't a 50-50 investment. And it wasn't funded by both countries equally. According to the project structure discussed throughout the controversy, Canada paid the bill. The entire bill. More than $6.4 billion. And that's the detail that immediately grabs people's attention. Because most viewers hear that number and ask the same question. If Canada paid for the bridge, why isn't it open? Why is a completed bridge sitting empty? And why are politicians suddenly arguing over it? Those questions have transformed what should have been a routine infrastructure success story into one of the most unusual political standoffs currently unfolding between Canada and the United States. Because over the last several months, the Gordie Howe International Bridge has become something far larger than steel and concrete. It's become leverage. It's become symbolism. And increasingly, it's become a test of patience, a test of political pressure, and perhaps most importantly, a test of who needs who more. Because while government officials continue discussing trade, tariffs, and negotiations, the bridge itself remains frozen in place, waiting, ready, unused. And the longer it remains closed, the more attention the story receives. Then came the statement that changed everything. A statement that immediately elevated this from an infrastructure story into a national political story. Because instead of demanding that the bridge open immediately, one of the people closest to the project delivered a completely different message. A message almost nobody expected to hear. Keep it closed. Not open it now. Not rush a deal. Not give in and move forward. Keep it closed. Even after years of construction. Even after billions of dollars. Even after waiting decades for the project to become reality. That single position shocked political observers on both sides of the border. Because it suggested something much larger was happening beneath the surface. This was no longer simply a debate about transportation, or border crossings, or trade logistics. This was becoming a debate about leverage. Who controls the negotiations, and who eventually blinks first? Because once you understand why Canada built this bridge, and once you understand why some people want it opened immediately while others appear willing to wait, the entire story starts looking very different. The bridge may be finished, but the real battle has only just begun. The first thing most people ask when they hear this story is simple. Why? Why would Canada spend more than $6 billion building an international bridge? Why pay for the entire project? Why not split the cost? Why take on that responsibility alone? At first glance, it doesn't seem to make much sense. After all, the bridge connects two countries, not one. The Gordie Howe International Bridge stretches between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. It's a border crossing, a shared piece of infrastructure. And yet the overwhelming financial burden fell on Canada. The answer begins with geography. Because while most people see a bridge, government sees supply chains, trade routes, economic corridors, strategic infrastructure, and few border crossings are more important than the Windsor-Detroit corridor. Every day, before the current dispute, thousands of trucks move through the region, auto parts, manufactured goods, industrial equipment, products that keep factories running on both sides of the border. The crossing isn't simply a road, it's one of the economic arteries of North America. That matters because modern manufacturing doesn't operate country by country anymore. A single vehicle assembled in North America may contain components that cross the border multiple times before the final product reaches consumers. Engines, electronics, steel components, assembly parts. Everything moves back and forth, which means delays at the border create problems far beyond Windsor and Detroit. For years, officials worried about relying too heavily on a single major crossing. The Ambassador Bridge handled enormous volumes of commercial traffic, but depending on one aging crossing created risks. Accidents, maintenance issues, security concerns, unexpected disruptions. If something happened to that route, entire supply chains could feel the impact. That concern helped drive support for a second major crossing. And that's where the Gordie Howe Bridge entered the picture. The goal wasn't merely to build another bridge. The goal was redundancy, capacity, resilience, a modern crossing designed to support future growth while reducing dependence on a single route. From Canada's perspective, the economic benefits justified the investment, which helps explain why Ottawa was willing to finance the project, even as debates continued over cost and politics. But that's also why the current standoff feels so unusual, because this wasn't supposed to be a controversial project. It was supposed to be a completed project, a success story, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a symbol of cooperation between two countries whose economies have been deeply connected for generations. Instead, the bridge has become the center of a political fight. And the deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes. Because while trade disputes and political disagreements are common, another factor was quietly sitting in the background. A factor that had been influencing this project for years: competition. Not between countries, between bridges. Just down the river sits the Ambassador Bridge, the older crossing that has carried traffic between Detroit and Windsor for decades. A bridge that generates revenue every time vehicles and trucks pass through it. And unlike the new crossing, that bridge is privately controlled. Now imagine what happens when a brand new modern crossing appears nearby. A crossing capable of attracting traffic. A crossing capable of changing economic patterns. A crossing capable of competing directly with an established business. The story isn't only about trade, and it isn't only about politics. It's also about competition, money, influence, and competing interests that may have very different ideas about what should happen next. Because the bridge wasn't just connecting two countries, it was threatening an existing system. And that's where this story starts becoming a lot more complicated than most headlines suggest. If the story ended with a delayed bridge, it would already be unusual. But it didn't end there. Because as journalists and political observers started looking deeper into the dispute, they noticed something that made the timeline far more interesting: the timing. For years, the Gordie Howe International Bridge had been controversial in some circles. Not because it wasn't needed, not because it wouldn't improve trade, but because it would compete directly with an existing crossing, the Ambassador Bridge, a bridge that has dominated traffic between Detroit and Windsor for decades. And unlike the new crossing, the Ambassador Bridge is privately owned. Every truck, every vehicle, every crossing generates revenue, which means a brand new government-backed bridge arriving nearby isn't just infrastructure, it's competition. Serious competition. That's why opponents of the Gordie Howe project had fought against it for years. Court battles, political lobbying, public campaigns. The conflict had existed long before the current trade dispute, long before the current negotiations, and long before the bridge was finally completed. Then came the sequence of events that caught people's attention. According to reporting referenced throughout the controversy, Matthew Morone, whose family controls the Ambassador Bridge business, had been lobbying against the new crossing and remained deeply interested in its future. And then something happened. A meeting, a conversation, political engagement behind the scenes. Nothing unusual on its own. Businesses lobby governments all the time. That's normal. What made people pay attention was what happened afterward. Because according to the timeline being discussed publicly, shortly after those contacts with administration officials, President Trump publicly raised objections surrounding the bridge and suggested it should not open until broader disputes were addressed. Now suddenly, people weren't only talking about trade, they were talking about influence. Was this really about tariffs? Was it really about trade fairness? Or had a much older fight resurfaced under a different label? Those questions started spreading quickly. To be clear, supporters of the administration argued that the concerns were legitimate, that trade grievances had existed for years, that economic imbalances deserved attention, and that infrastructure projects should not be isolated from larger negotiations. Those arguments had supporters, and they still do. But critics saw something different. They looked at the timeline. They looked at the bridge. They looked at who benefited if the new crossing remained closed. And they began asking difficult questions. Questions that political leaders suddenly found themselves answering in interviews and press conferences. Because here's the reality. Every major political story eventually becomes a battle over motive. Not what happened, but why did it happen? And that's where this story became far more complicated than a simple infrastructure dispute. If the bridge opens, trade gains a new route, traffic gains new capacity, supply chains gain flexibility, and a long-awaited project finally begins operating. If the bridge stays closed, the old system remains in place, the existing traffic patterns remain in place, and the pressure shifts back onto negotiators. Those are very different outcomes. That's why observers on both sides of the border started focusing less on the bridge itself and more on the leverage surrounding it. Because leverage was everywhere. Trade leverage, political leverage, economic leverage, and perhaps most importantly, time leverage. Who could afford to wait longer? That question would soon become the center of the entire standoff, because while Washington was applying pressure, something unexpected was happening in Windsor. Instead of demanding immediate action, local leaders began sending a completely different message, a message that surprised almost everyone watching. If the price of opening the bridge is a bad deal, then maybe the bridge should stay closed. And that's when the story stopped being about pressure and became a test of patience. Up until this point, the story had followed a familiar pattern: pressure, negotiation, escalation, the kind of political standoff we've seen many times before. One side applies pressure, the other side looks for a compromise. Eventually, a deal appears, everybody claims victory, and the story disappears. That's why what happened next caught so many observers off guard. Because instead of demanding that the bridge open immediately, one of the people closest to the project delivered a completely different message, a message that seemed to defy political gravity itself. Keep it closed. The statement came from Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkins, a man who had spent years watching this project move from proposal to construction and finally to completion. A man whose city had waited decades for the bridge to become reality. A man who, by every conventional expectation, should have been pushing harder than anyone to see it open. Instead, he said something very different. If opening the bridge required accepting a bad deal, then don't accept the deal. Wait, keep negotiating, and if necessary, keep the bridge closed. That statement changed the entire story, because suddenly the assumption underneath the dispute began to crack. The assumption that Canada was desperate. The assumption that Canada needed immediate access. The assumption that Canada would eventually blink first. Those assumptions had quietly shaped discussions around the bridge for months, maybe even years, and now they were being challenged publicly. Think about the confidence required to make that argument. A finished bridge, more than $6 billion invested, years of planning, years of construction, years of anticipation, and yet the message wasn't, open it now. The message was, we can wait. That's not how most infrastructure disputes sound. Usually the pressure comes from the side that paid. Usually the pressure comes from the side that built. Usually the pressure comes from the side waiting to use the project. But Windsor was signaling something different. Patience. And patience can be a powerful negotiating tool. Because patience changes leverage. The moment one side proves it can wait, the timeline changes, the assumptions change. And suddenly the question becomes, who actually needs the deal more? That question sits at the center of this entire story. Supporters of the Windsor position pointed to a simple reality. Traffic volumes had already slowed because of broader trade tensions and tariff disputes. The existing Ambassador Bridge was still handling traffic. There was no immediate transportation emergency, no collapsing supply chain, no crisis forcing Canada into a rushed agreement. That meant something important. Time was no longer working in only one direction. For decades, many Canadians operated under the assumption that access to the American market gave Washington the stronger hand. And economically, the United States remains the larger partner. Nobody disputes that. But the bridge dispute introduced a different question. What happens when the smaller partner decides it can wait? What happens when urgency disappears? What happens when pressure stops producing movement? That's when leverage becomes harder to measure. Because leverage isn't always about size. Sometimes it's about patience. Sometimes it's about endurance. And sometimes it's about convincing the other side that you're perfectly comfortable staying exactly where you are. That's what made the Keep It Closed message so powerful. Not because it solved the dispute, not because it ended negotiations, but because it revealed a completely different mindset. A mindset that many observers felt represented a broader shift in Canada's approach to dealing with pressure from its larger neighbor. And while that debate was unfolding, another development was attracting attention. Because this wasn't simply a Canada versus America dispute anymore. Inside the United States itself, many leaders were openly pushing for the bridge to open. Governors, business groups, industry leaders, even officials whose own economies stood to benefit from the project, which created a surprising situation. The bridge wasn't dividing Canada from America. It was dividing interests on both sides of the border. And that made the standoff even more complicated. Because when a finished $6.4 billion bridge becomes a test of patience, the real question is no longer whether it will open. The real question is, who decides the terms? By now, most people watching this story have picked a side. Some see a country standing its ground. Others see an unnecessary political standoff. Some blame Washington. Others blame Ottawa. But while politicians argue, another question is quietly becoming more important. Who is actually paying the price for all of this? Because bridges aren't built for politicians. They're built for people, truck drivers, factory workers, manufacturers, suppliers, businesses that move products back and forth across the border every single day. And that's where the story becomes much bigger than a dispute over ownership or trade negotiations. The Windsor-Detroit corridor isn't just another border crossing. It's one of the most important commercial gateways in North America. For decades, automakers, suppliers, logistics companies, and manufacturers have relied on the region to keep production moving. Parts cross the border, components cross the border, finished products cross the border, sometimes multiple times before reaching consumers. That's how integrated the two economies have become, which means every delay carries a cost. Not necessarily a dramatic cost overnight, but a gradual cost, an opportunity cost, a flexibility cost, a resilience cost. Because the entire purpose of the Gordie Howe Bridge was to provide additional capacity and reduce dependence on a single crossing. Think about it. For years, leaders, planners, and businesses argued that relying so heavily on one bridge created risks. What if traffic surged? What if disruptions occurred? What if maintenance problems developed? What if supply chains needed another route? The new bridge was supposed to solve those concerns. That was the entire point. And yet today, the solution exists, but remains unused. That's why business groups and political leaders in Michigan have been watching the situation so closely. Because for them, this isn't simply a diplomatic disagreement. It's an economic issue. Jobs, investment, transportation efficiency, future growth. Many Michigan officials have publicly supported opening the bridge because they view it as beneficial to the state's economy and long-term competitiveness. And that's where the political picture becomes surprisingly complicated, because this is not a clean Canada versus America story, not even close. Within Canada, there are different perspectives. Within the United States, there are different perspectives. Businesses have one set of priorities. Politicians have another. Trade negotiators have another. Local communities have another. Everybody wants something slightly different. And that's why finding a solution becomes so difficult. Because infrastructure follows economics. Politics follows incentives. And incentives rarely align perfectly. The people moving freight want efficiency. The people negotiating trade deals want leverage. The people running businesses want certainty. The people running campaigns want victories. Those objectives don't always point in the same direction. That's one reason this bridge became such a powerful symbol. On paper, it's a transportation project. In reality, it's become a scoreboard. Every day it stays closed, both sides interpret the situation differently. One side sees patience, the other sees pressure. One side sees strength, the other sees delay. And the longer the standoff continues, the more symbolic the bridge becomes. That's what makes this dispute different from a normal construction delay. The bridge isn't waiting for engineers. It's waiting for politics. And politics operates on a completely different timeline. A timeline where perception matters, negotiation matters, and leverage matters. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. The question hiding underneath every headline. The question that determines how this story ultimately ends. Who blinks first? Because eventually, someone has to make a decision. Someone has to move. Someone has to decide whether the benefits of holding out are greater than the benefits of reaching a deal. And that's where the next chapter begins. Because the bridge will open. Almost everyone agrees on that. The mystery isn't whether it opens. The mystery is whose terms survive when it does. At some point, every standoff reaches the same moment. The moment where symbolism collides with reality. The moment where patience meets pressure. The moment where someone finally decides whether to keep waiting or make a deal. That's where this story is heading. Because despite all the headlines, despite all the political statements, and despite all the public disagreement, very few people actually believe the Gordie Howe Bridge will remain closed forever. The bridge will open, eventually. The real debate is about what happens before that day arrives. Will Washington secure concessions it believes are necessary? Will Ottawa maintain its current position? Will negotiators quietly reach a compromise behind closed doors? Or will both governments continue testing each other's patience? Nobody knows. And that's exactly why the story continues attracting attention. The uncertainty has become part of the narrative. Every week without an opening date creates more speculation. Every statement creates more analysis. Every delay creates more questions. And every question leads back to the same issue. Leverage. Who has it? Who is using it? And how much is it actually worth? Because leverage only works if the other side feels pressure. And that's what made Windsor's response so unexpected. The message suggested that pressure alone would not be enough, that waiting was acceptable, that time itself could become part of the strategy. Whether people agree with that approach or not, it undeniably changed the conversation. For decades, many Canada-US disputes followed a familiar script. One side applied pressure, the other side reacted. Compromises emerged, and the relationship moved forward. This story feels different, not because the relationship has collapsed, not because cooperation has disappeared, but because both sides appear more willing to test boundaries than before. And perhaps that's the deeper meaning of the bridge. The structure itself matters. The economic impact matters. The trade implications matter. But the bridge has also become a symbol of something larger. A changing relationship. A changing understanding of leverage between two countries that remain deeply connected. Eventually, an opening date will appear. Trucks will cross. Cars will cross. The bridge will finally begin doing what it was built to do. And when that happens, most people will focus on the opening ceremony, the speeches, the headlines, the ribbon cutting. But the more important story may be everything that happened before it opened. Because the bridge was never just about transportation. It became a test of patience, a test of leverage, and a test of who was willing to wait the longest. A $6.4 billion bridge sits finished, ready, waiting, and for now, still closed. What was supposed to be a symbol of cooperation became a symbol of negotiation. What was supposed to reduce friction became the center of it. And what was supposed to be a bridge between two economies became a test of who controls the terms, whether you view the situation as strategic patience, political leverage, or simply another chapter in a long history of Canada-US disputes. One thing is clear. This story is no longer about concrete and steel. It's about power. And until an opening date finally appears, the question remains unanswered. Who blinks first? Thank you for watching USA News Now. I'm Daniel Mercer. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more coverage of geopolitics, international trade, and the stories shaping North America and the world. Until next time, we'll be watching what happens next.